The Night Stalker killed at least 13 times.
We are all evil in some form or another.
Today, the search for California's Night Stalker continues.
Everyone has their own story about who Richard Ramirez actually was and the reasons that led him to perform his brutal and heartless acts upon his victims. But in this video, we're going deeper into his story. Serial murderer Richard Ramirez claims to be the right-hand man of Satan.
As evil's human embodiment.
Yes, I am evil.
He was labeled the walk-in killer by KNBC Los Angeles. Others called him the Valley Intruder. But the Night Stalker was the term that remained, the one the news media and Ramirez himself embraced. Richard was responsible for the elimination of at least 13 people in the mid-1980s.
But the Night Stalker killed at least 13 times,
earning him the shivering title of the Night Stalker. His criminal career, on the other hand, began much earlier. Richard Ramirez was born on February 29, 1960, and grew up in El Paso, Texas. Ramirez said that his father mistreated him physically and that he suffered multiple brain injuries as a child. One of the injuries was so severe that it caused him to suffer repeat epileptic episodes with no support from his parents during these occurrences.
We are all evil in some form or another.
Even though Richard had 4 older siblings to fool around with, he preferred to spend all of his time with his cousin Michael, a Vietnam veteran, to escape from his abusive father. Although Michael's impact, unfortunately, was not much better than his father's. Michael had the most influence over Richard. Michael enjoyed violating and afterwards executing the Vietnamese women for his entertainment. According to Little Richie, when he was only 12 years old, his cousin Michael showed him disturbing photographs of himself and the brutal acts that he performed upon his victims. Above that, Michael also taught Richard how to use a gun, as well as how to operate a knife. After a few months of Michael's return from the war and their regular outings together, one day another tragedy sadly occurred. When Ramirez was just 13 years old, he witnessed his cousin fatally shoot his own wife. That extra act of violent behavior triggered something in Ramirez, and he began changing from a fearful, tortured youngster to a hardened, gloomy young man shortly after witnessing the shooting. Richard's life took a nasty turn when he developed an interest in Satanism and became addicted to narcotics. Worse, he was still under the spell of his cousin Michael, who had been declared not guilty of the murder due to insanity. He became obsessed with the types of violent and physical abuse that Michael had perpetrated on the ladies in his photographs. Ramirez also began to have more run-ins with the law, particularly after relocating to Los Angeles. Though most of his early crimes were related to theft and drug possession in the late 1970s and early 1980s, it was only a matter of time before it escalated to gruesome and horrific violence. Richard's first elimination occurred on June 28, 1984, where he violated and stabbed a 79-year-old widow. Ramirez not only stabbed and violated his victim, but he took it a step further. The injury he inflicted on her neck was so severe that it nearly left her decapitated. In the same year, just months prior, on April 10, 1984, DNA evidence tied him to the murder of a 9-year-old girl. However, Ramirez was not charged with the crime. Richard Ramirez laid low for a couple of months as the awareness caught many people's attention during the investigation.
Do you have emotions, Richard?
No comment.
But once he decided to attack again, he was ruthless in the pursuit of his heinous desires. His savage spree resumed around March 17, 1985, when he assaulted Maria Hernandez in her house. Hernandez was able to flee, but her roommate, Dale Okazaki, was not so fortunate. That evening, Okazaki became the latest victim of Ramirez's homicide spree. Ramirez, on the other hand, was far from finished. He brutally shot and executed another victim, Shi Lian Yu, later that night. A week or so later, he yet again broke into another victim's house. This was the house of Vincent Zazara, 64, and his 44-year-old wife, Maxine. He then began to establish his distinctive attack strategy at that point: fatally shoot the husband, then assault the wife. The elimination of Maxine, however, was particularly heinous, as he violated, stabbed, and gouged out her eyes. Ramirez stalked and executed numerous victims in California for months, instilling fear in the hearts of residents across the state. Ramirez's willingness to attack just about anybody who crossed his path was one of the scariest characteristics. Richard Ramirez, unlike some other serial killers who have a type, executed both men and women and preyed on both young and old victims.
You could sense it. There's evil in that man.
Ramirez initially appeared to be targeting folks in the Los Angeles area, but he soon added a couple of victims in the San Francisco area. And since he was labeled the Night Stalker by the press, it was evident that the majority of his atrocities took place at night. Surprisingly, many of his attacks had a satanic component to them. Ramirez would carve pentagrams into the bodies of his victims in some situations. In other situations, he would have victims swear their obedience to Satan. People across California went to bed fearing that the Night Stalker would break into their homes as they slept to violate, torture, and then execute them. Since he seemed to attack at random, it was clear that no one was safe. The LAPD expanded its presence on the streets and even formed a special task team to track him down, with assistance from the FBI. Meanwhile, public fear was so high at that time that gun purchases, lock installations, burglar alarms, and attack dogs all saw a significant increase. But in the end, it was Richard Ramirez's own faults that led to his arrest in August 1985. He left a footprint outside a witness's house after being observed, and he also left his automobile and registration plate out in the open. The cops were able to uncover just enough of a fingerprint to make a match when they tracked down the vehicle. They had already received information that someone with the surname Ramirez was engaged at that point. With the help of their new computer database of fingerprints, the LAPD was able to identify Richard Ramirez. And despite the fact that records only contained convicts born after January 1960, Ramirez was born in February of that year. Authorities quickly discovered Ramirez's previous arrest mugshots, and one of his surviving victims came forward with a detailed description that matched the images. By the end of August 1985, police had decided to make the image and identity of the Night Stalker public. Ramirez was returning to Los Angeles when his photo was revealed. Upon his return to the city, he saw his own face in the media. A convenience shop in Los Angeles was the setting for the serial killer Richard Ramirez's entry on August 31, 1985. At first glance, he appeared to be an ordinary shopper. However, he was startled when he recognized his own face on the front of a newspaper and fled for his life. As of that moment, Ramirez had already been identified as the primary suspect in the gruesome Night Stalker attacks that had terrified California for more than a year prior. However, authorities had only just revealed his identity and photograph to the public just as he was boarding a plane to return to Los Angeles. This provided residents with ample opportunity to become familiar with his physical features and identify him to authorities as he rushed out of the airport. Ramirez had little possibility of escaping as a result of the situation, but of course, he made another attempt to flee.
A killer who apparently struck again during the weekend.
It took 7 police cars and a helicopter to hunt Ramirez down around the city in the ensuing chase that ended in a shootout. However, he was overtaken by an enraged mob of onlookers who identified him before he could flee. They became enraged at his horrific deeds and began to beat him with a metal pipe. At least one of them was a police officer. In fact, by the time the police arrived, Ramirez had nearly expressed gratitude to them for apprehending him. Ramirez was arrested and charged with 13 executions. He was also accused of physical violation, robberies, and burglaries. Ramirez was sentenced to death in the gas chamber for his acts, where he replied with a smile, "I am beyond good and evil," said the Night Stalker. "I will be avenged. Lucifer lives in us all. That's it."
We are all evil in some form or another. Yes, I am evil. Evil has always existed. The perfect world most people seek shall never come to pass. And it's gonna get worse.
He was sent to San Quentin State Prison, but was never sentenced to death. He couldn't appeal until 2006 due to the case's complexity, which included a 50,000-page trial record. Even if the court denied his claims, he would have to appeal for years. During his time in prison, he met Doreen Leoy, a female admirer who had started communicating with him during the long delay. He ended up marrying her in 1996 while on death row.
Killing is killing, whether done for duty, profit, or fun.